October 12th, 1943, Las Vegas Army Airfield, Nevada. Staff Sergeant Michael Russo squeezed the trigger of the .50 caliber Browning mounted on the bed of the moving truck, watching tracer rounds arc uselessly behind the clay target that sailed past at 30 degrees deflection. The target shattered from another student's gun, someone who understood what Russo did not yet grasp. His instructor, a combat veteran with 22 missions over Germany, leaned close and shouted over the engine noise. "You're aiming at where it is, not where it's going to be." Russo had fired 300 rounds that morning. He had hit nothing. The mathematics of deflection shooting, the art of hitting a moving target from a moving platform, remained a mystery his mind could not solve in the fractions of a second available. Within 6 weeks, he would be assigned to a B-17 crew bound for England. Within 3 months, he would face German fighters attacking at combined closing speeds, approaching 500 miles per hour. And unless he learned to aim not at the target but at empty space 50 feet ahead of where the target would be when his bullets arrived, he would die without ever scoring a hit. What Russo could not know on that October morning was that the training system itself was fundamentally flawed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Army Air Forces had been teaching gunners to aim ahead of attacking fighters, to lead their targets like duck hunters lead flying birds. But in October 1943, a revolutionary new doctrine would emerge from the Central Flexible Gunnery Instructors School, a method so counterintuitive that experienced gunners initially refused to believe it could work. The position firing system would teach Russo and tens of thousands of other gunners to aim not ahead of attacking fighters, but behind them, to compensate for a factor that conventional deflection shooting completely ignored. The forward speed of the bomber itself, adding to the velocity of every bullet fired, meant that traditional deflection calculations were producing systematic errors that cost lives. German fighter pilots attacking American bomber formations in the autumn of 1943 had refined their tactics to devastating effectiveness. The head-on attack, pioneered by pilots like Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II, exploited the bomber's weakest defensive sector. A Focke-Wulf 190 attacking from 12 o'clock level, boring straight at the lead bomber, presented the most difficult gunnery problem in aerial warfare. The closing speed approached 500 miles per hour. The combined velocity of two aircraft racing toward each other at maximum speed meant 730 feet per second. A German pilot had approximately 3 seconds from the moment he opened fire at maximum range until he had to execute his violent breakaway maneuver to avoid collision. In those 3 seconds, if his aim was accurate, his 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns would shred the bomber's nose compartment, kill the bombardier and navigator, destroy the flight controls, and send a 65,000-pound aircraft into a fatal dive. The B-17E and F models that flew combat missions through early 1943 carried minimal forward armament. 2 manually operated 30 caliber machine guns in flexible mounts, operated by the navigator and bombardier, men whose primary duties were navigation and bombing, not gunnery. These officers had received perhaps a single day of gunnery training at their operational training units. Against attacking fighters flown by German pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience, these forward guns provided almost no effective defense. The development of the B-17G with its Bendix chin turret mounting 250 caliber guns finally provided adequate forward firepower. But the turret could only be effective if the gunner, typically the bombardier, could aim it accurately during the brief window when fighters presented themselves as targets. The mathematics remained brutally difficult. Consider the problem facing a waist gunner on a B-17F cruising at 180 miles per hour at 25,000 feet over Germany. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 approaches from the 3 o'clock position, executing a standard beam attack. The fighter travels at 320 miles per hour. Its angular velocity across the gunner's field of view changes continuously as ranges and angles shift. The .50 caliber Browning M2 fires bullets at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,700 feet per second, but that velocity is relative to the gun barrel. The bomber carrying the gun is moving forward at 180 miles per hour, which equals 264 feet per second. Every bullet fired from that bomber inherits the bomber's forward velocity in addition to its muzzle velocity. When a gunner aims his weapon perpendicular to the bomber's flight path, firing directly out the side, the bullet does not travel perpendicular to the bomber. It travels forward and to the side simultaneously. The bullet's actual trajectory through space is the vector sum of its muzzle velocity and the bomber's forward speed. Traditional deflection shooting doctrine taught gunners to lead their targets, to aim ahead of the attacking fighter by an amount that compensated for the time required for bullets to reach the target. A fighter at 500 yards range, traveling perpendicular to the bomber, would move approximately 100 feet during the half-second required for bullets to cover that distance. The gunner was taught to aim 100 feet ahead of the fighter, placing his sight reticle on empty air where the fighter would be when the bullets arrived. This method worked adequately when shooting from stationary platforms. Duck hunters had used it for centuries. Fighter pilots attacking other fighters used similar techniques, though they benefited from forward-firing guns that simplified the calculations. But for bomber gunners, traditional deflection shooting produced systematic errors. The problem was the bomber's forward speed. When a gunner fired perpendicular to the bomber's flight path, his bullets did not travel perpendicular. They traveled forward and sideways. The faster the bomber moved, the more pronounced this effect became. At typical combat speeds, bullets fired to the side actually traveled at an angle approximately 15 degrees forward of perpendicular. This meant that a gunner aiming ahead of his target, compensating for deflection using traditional duck hunting methods, was actually aiming too far ahead. His bullets, carrying the bomber's forward velocity, would curve forward of his point of aim and pass ahead of the target. Through the first year of American daylight bombing operations over Europe, bomber gunners experienced frustratingly low hit rates. Combat action reports from missions flown in 1942 and early 1943 repeatedly document expenditure of all available ammunition without confirmed kills. Gunners reported seeing their tracer rounds pass harmlessly ahead of or behind attacking fighters. Part of the problem was simple inexperience. Aerial gunnery required skills that could only be developed through practice, and many gunners arrived in combat zones with minimal training. But even experienced gunners, men who had flown multiple missions and survived, reported difficulty achieving hits. The mathematical principles they had been taught simply did not produce the results predicted. In summer 1943, instructors at the Army Air Force's Central Flexible Gunnery School began systematic analysis of the problem. They studied combat camera footage, examined gun camera film, and interviewed returning combat gunners. The pattern became clear. Gunners using traditional deflection methods consistently fired ahead of their targets when engaging fighters attacking from beam or quarter positions. The solution emerged from first principles of physics and ballistics. If the bomber's forward velocity was adding to every bullet's trajectory, then gunners needed to compensate not by aiming further ahead, but by aiming further behind. Instead of leading the target, they needed to aim behind it by a specific amount, calculated based on the fighter's angular position relative to the bomber's fore and aft axis. This was the position firing system. The method was counterintuitive, violating every instinct gunners had developed through traditional deflection training. But the mathematics were irrefutable. When a fighter attacked from a beam position, perpendicular to the bomber's flight path, the gunner should aim not ahead of the fighter, but between the fighter and the bomber's tail. The bomber's forward speed would carry the bullets forward into the fighter's flight path. The Central Flexible Gunnery Instructors School developed the position firing doctrine in collaboration with experienced combat gunners and mathematical analysts. The system was codified in a restricted manual dated November 1, 1943, titled "Get That Fighter." The manual opened with a statement that challenged everything gunners thought they knew about aerial combat. This book deals only with the shot when he is actually coming in at you. Believe it or not, when a fighter is making his attack, you don't aim ahead, as in other shots. Always aim between him and the tail of your own plane, because the forward speed of your plane is added to the speed of your bullet. The amount you aim behind is deflection. The manual introduced the concept of cones of deflection. When a fighter attacked from a certain angle relative to the bomber's fore and aft axis, regardless of whether the attack came from above, below, left, or right, the required deflection remained constant. A fighter at 30 degrees off the nose required the same deflection whether it was level, diving, or climbing. The angle to the bomber's longitudinal axis determined everything. Gunners learned to visualize cones rotating around the bomber's fore and aft axis. Each cone represented a specific deflection requirement measured in radians, a unit familiar to mathematicians but foreign to most aerial gunners. The training simplified these measurements into practical rules that could be remembered and applied under combat stress. Zero deflection, attacks from dead ahead or dead astern. Aim directly at the fighter. 1/4 deflection. Attacks from 0 to 20 degrees off the nose or tail. Aim slightly behind the fighter, between the fighter and the bomber's longitudinal axis. 3/4 deflection. Attacks from 30 to 60 degrees. Aim significantly behind the fighter. Full deflection. Attacks from 60 to 90 degrees, pure beam attacks. Aim between the fighter and the bomber's tail, leading the fighter by aiming behind it to compensate for the bomber's forward speed. The system required gunners to estimate quickly the angular position of attacking fighters and apply the appropriate deflection. In the chaos of combat, with multiple fighters attacking simultaneously, with the bomber maneuvering to avoid flak, with wounded crew members bleeding on the deck and the temperature 40 below zero at altitude, making these calculations demanded extraordinary discipline and training. Staff Sergeant Russo completed his 6-week gunnery course at Las Vegas Army Airfield in late November 1943. He had fired thousands of rounds from truck-mounted guns against clay targets. He had flown training missions in modified AT-6 aircraft, firing flexible guns at towed sleeve targets. He had spent hours in synthetic trainers, tracking moving lights projected on curved screens while instructors critiqued his technique. Most importantly, he had internalized the position firing system. The counterintuitive method had become instinctive through repetition. When he tracked a target crossing from beam to quarter, his hands automatically adjusted the sight picture, aiming not where intuition suggested, but where the mathematics demanded. His hit rate on the training ranges improved from 0 to approximately 20%, a figure that instructors considered adequate for combat operations. Russo was assigned to the 381st Bombardment Group, stationed at Ridgewell, England. He arrived in January 1944 as a replacement crew member, filling a vacancy created when a ball turret gunner was killed over keel. The crew he joined had flown 8 missions. They were no longer novices, but they had yet to develop the cold efficiency that characterized veteran crews who had survived 20 or more missions into German airspace. His first combat mission was to Brunswick on January 11, 1944. The target was an aircraft component factory. The 381st put up 36 B-17Gs that morning, flying in 2 18 aircraft formations. Russo's aircraft, serial number 4, 2-37917, flew in the number 3 position of the low squadron, one of the most exposed and dangerous positions in the combat box formation. The mission profile was typical of deep penetration raids conducted during that period. Assembly over England required 90 minutes as groups from multiple airfields formed up into combat wings. The bomber stream, once assembled, stretched for miles. Over 200 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds headed east that morning, escorted initially by Republic P-47 Thunderbolts that would accompany them to the limit of their range before turning back. At the German border, the escorts departed. The distinctive waggling of wings, the traditional farewell gesture, marked the moment when bomber crews knew they would face the Luftwaffe alone. The first attacks came 20 minutes later over Osnabrück. Single-engine fighters, mostly, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, positioned themselves ahead of the bomber stream. Russo watched from his ball turret position as the first wave formed up. 12 fighters, flying in Kette formation, positioned themselves at 10 o'clock high, approximately 8,000 feet above and ahead of the lead bomber formation. They rolled inverted, pulled through into vertical dives, and accelerated to maximum speed. At 4,000 yards, they opened fire. The head-on attacks came in waves. The fighters presented the most difficult target imaginable, small silhouettes closing at 500 miles per hour, exposed to defensive fire for perhaps 3 seconds. Russo rotated his turret, trying to track fighters as they flashed past below the formation. His training had emphasized the importance of firing during the brief window when fighters transitioned from their diving attack to their breakaway. For a ball turret gunner, this transition presented opportunities. Fighters pulling up after attacking often exposed their vulnerable undersides. A skilled gunner who anticipated the maneuver could position his turret, estimate the deflection based on the fighter's angular position, and fire a burst timed to intercept the target. The mathematics of position firing meant aiming behind the fighter's apparent position, trusting that the bomber's forward speed would carry bullets into the fighter's flight path. Russo fired his first combat burst at a Focke-Wulf that had just completed a head-on pass against the lead squadron. The fighter pulled up and left, climbing away from the formation. Russo estimated the angle at 45 degrees, 3/4 deflection. He aimed between the fighter and his bomber's tail, leading by aiming behind, and pressed both thumb triggers simultaneously. Both 50 caliber guns fired, their recoil transmitted through the turret structure. Tracer rounds, every 5th bullet in the belt loaded with phosphorus, marked the bullet stream. The tracers curved through space, arcing forward and up. They appeared to pass behind the fighter, but Russo maintained his tracking, adjusting continuously as the range opened and the angles changed. The fighter suddenly rolled hard right, smoke trailing from its left wing root. The pilot executed a split S and dove away, disappearing through the undercast 8,000 feet below. Russo did not know if his burst had caused the damage or if another gunner had hit the same target. Multiple bombers often fired at the same fighter simultaneously. Attribution was impossible. The mission continued. Brunswick was reached, bombs were dropped with mixed accuracy through gaps in the cloud cover, and the formation turned for home. The return flight brought additional fighter attacks, less intense than those faced during the penetration but still dangerous. Russo fired hundreds of rounds, always applying position firing principles, always aiming behind to compensate for the bomber's forward motion. His aircraft returned to Ridgewell with moderate battle damage. Flak over the target had punched several holes through the wings and tail surfaces, and German fighters had destroyed the radio operator's compartment gun. 2 crew members sustained minor injuries from shell fragments, but the aircraft was repairable and the crew was operational. They would fly again in 3 days. The mathematical principles underlying position firing represented a fundamental truth about ballistics that had been imperfectly understood during earlier conflicts. The recognition that a bullet fired from a moving platform inherits the platform's velocity was not new. 19th-century artillery officers had dealt with similar problems when firing from moving ships, but applying these principles to high-speed aerial combat, where both shooter and target moved in 3 dimensions at velocities approaching 300 miles per hour, demanded new approaches to gunnery training. The position firing system represented American military's systematic approach to solving tactical problems through scientific analysis and standardized doctrine. The effectiveness of position firing could not be precisely measured through available statistical records. Combat action reports document bomber defensive claims, but these claims were consistently overestimated. During missions where gunners claimed hundreds of fighters destroyed, German loss records typically showed actual losses of perhaps 10 to 20% of claimed numbers. This overestimation occurred for understandable reasons. Multiple gunners often fired at the same fighter. When that fighter was seen to fall, all gunners who had fired at it submitted claims. Additionally, fighters seen trailing smoke or diving away were often claimed as destroyed when they actually returned to base with repairable damage. What can be documented is that bomber gunners trained in position firing reported increased confidence in their shooting and perceived their bursts to be more accurately directed. Instructors at gunnery schools noted that students trained in position firing achieved higher hit rates on towed targets and synthetic training devices compared to students trained exclusively in traditional deflection methods. The German perspective on American bomber defensive fire evolved throughout 1943 and 44. Luftwaffe fighter pilots recognized that attacking B-17 and B-24 formations had become increasingly dangerous. The tight combat box formations, pioneered by officers like Colonel Curtis LeMay, concentrated defensive firepower to extraordinary degrees. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A 54-plane combat wing fielded over 700 heavy machine guns. German tactical doctrine adapted to these realities. By late 1943, fighter units emphasized attacking bombers that had fallen out of formation due to battle damage or mechanical failure. These stragglers, deprived of mutual defensive support from other bombers, could be overwhelmed by concentrated attacks. Approximately half of all American bombers lost to fighter attack were aircraft that had left the protection of the combat box. Against intact formations, German fighters employed increasingly desperate tactics. The Sturmgruppen, specialized bomber-destroyer units, equipped Focke-Wulf 190s with additional armor plating and heavy cannon. These heavily armed fighters would close to point-blank range, accepting hits from defensive fire to deliver decisive blows against their targets. The mathematical realities of aerial combat during this period were unforgiving. A bomber gunner facing a head-on attack had approximately 3 seconds to acquire the target, estimate deflection, and fire an effective burst. The fighter presented a frontal silhouette, measuring perhaps 10 feet wide and 5 feet high. At 500 yards range and closing at 700 feet per second, achieving hits required extraordinary precision. Position firing provided gunners with a systematic method for calculating aim points under these impossible conditions. The method did not guarantee hits, nothing could, but it removed one significant source of error: the systematic tendency of traditionally trained gunners to aim too far ahead of their targets and waste ammunition on shots that could never connect. Through the winter of 1943 to 44, tens of thousands of bomber gunners deployed to England had been trained in position firing methods. The doctrine was codified in training materials, integrated into gunnery school curricula, and reinforced through operational training at replacement centers. New gunners arriving at bomb groups received additional briefings emphasizing the importance of aiming behind to compensate for platform motion. Staff Sergeant Russo flew his 10th mission on February 20, 1944. The target was Leipzig, an aircraft assembly plant deep in central Germany. This mission was part of Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, the concentrated effort to destroy German fighter production and crush the Luftwaffe through systematic attrition. The formation faced intense opposition. German fighter controllers threw every available unit against the bomber stream. Over 300 Luftwaffe fighters intercepted the formations during penetration and withdrawal. The attacks came in coordinated waves, with fighters from multiple Geschwader timing their assaults to overwhelm local defensive capabilities. Russo's position in the ball turret provided a unique perspective on the battle developing around him. He could rotate 360 degrees, tracking targets from almost any angle. When fighters attacked from below, diving up through the formation, he was often the only gunner who could engage them effectively. During the bomb run, when the bombers flew straight and level to allow the bombardiers to use their Norden bomb sights, the formation was particularly vulnerable. German fighters concentrated their attacks during these critical minutes, knowing that bomber pilots could not take evasive action without disrupting the bombing. Russo fired continuously during the bomb run, tracking fighters as they made slashing attacks through the formation from below. One Messerschmitt Bf. 109, painted in distinctive yellow-nosed markings identifying it as belonging to Jagdgeschwader 2, pulled up directly beneath his aircraft after attacking the low squadron. The fighter pilot, possibly wounded or his aircraft damaged, did not execute the expected vertical breakaway. Instead, the Messerschmitt climbed at a shallower angle, remaining in Russo's sights for nearly 4 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. Russo estimated the deflection, approximately 30 degrees, and aimed between the fighter and his bomber's tail. He pressed both triggers and held them down, firing a sustained burst of perhaps 70 rounds. The tracers streamed toward the fighter. Most passed harmlessly into empty space, but Russo saw strikes along the fighter's right wing and fuselage, pieces of metal separated from the aircraft. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and went straight down, disappearing through clouds 6,000 feet below the formation. This was the clearest victory Russo would claim during his combat tour. The fighter had been isolated, clearly visible, and had remained in his sights long enough for sustained, accurate fire. Most aerial gunnery involved snapshots at fleeting targets, brief bursts at fighters that appeared and vanished in seconds. Clear attribution was rare. The Leipzig mission cost the 381st Bombardment Group 4 aircraft lost and 7 more so heavily damaged they were scrapped upon return to England. But the group put ordnance on target, and reconnaissance photographs showed significant damage to the manufacturing facilities. The strategic campaign was succeeding, despite horrific costs. The cumulative effect of position firing across thousands of bomber sorties during 1944 is difficult to quantify precisely from declassified records. What can be documented is the testimony of gunners who flew combat missions both before and after receiving position firing training. These men uniformly reported that the new method felt counterintuitive initially but produced better results once mastered. Technical Sergeant William Morrison, a waist gunner with the 303rd Bombardment Group, wrote in a letter home preserved in the National Archives that position firing made no sense until you saw the tracers actually hit where the manual said they would. You aim behind the jerry and your bullets curve forward into him because your bomber is carrying them forward. Once you understand that, you stop wasting ammunition. The training infrastructure required to implement position firing across the entire bomber force represented a massive organizational effort. By early 1944, the Army Air Forces operated multiple gunnery schools across the United States. Las Vegas Army Airfield in Nevada, Harlingen Army Airfield in Texas, and Tyndall Field in Florida graduated hundreds of gunners every week. Each school incorporated position firing into its curriculum. Students began with ground-based training using shotguns mounted on trucks driven through courses while students fired at clay targets. The shotgun training, borrowed from skeet shooting, developed the fundamental skills of tracking moving targets and timing trigger pulls. But shotgun pellets travel so slowly compared to bullets that they require more lead, so instructors emphasized that aircraft gunnery would require different calculations. Advanced training used modified AT-6 Texan aircraft fitted with flexible guns. Students flew as gunners while the aircraft maneuvered against towed sleeve targets. The sleeves, fabric cylinders towed behind AT-6 or AT-11 tugs, provided moving targets at realistic speeds. Each student's ammunition was dipped in different colored paint so that hits could be attributed to specific gunners when the sleeve was recovered and examined. The most sophisticated training device was the Waller Gunnery Trainer, a projection system that displayed moving fighter silhouettes on a large curved screen. Students sat in actual turrets or gun positions and tracked the projected targets using camera guns that recorded where they aimed. Instructors could replay the footage, showing students exactly where their bullets would have gone if they had been firing live ammunition. These trainers could simulate complex attack profiles impossible to replicate safely with actual aircraft. A projected fighter could execute a diving attack from 12 o'clock high, roll inverted, and pull through the bomber formation at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Students learned to track these maneuvers and apply appropriate deflection based on the fighter's angular position. By mid-1944, some gunnery schools had access to an extraordinary training tool. Bell Aircraft had modified P-63 King Cobra fighters into RP-63 pinball aircraft covered in duralumin armor plating. These aircraft could be used as actual targets, with students firing frangible bullets that shattered harmlessly against the armor. When bullets struck the aircraft, a system of sensors triggered red lights on the nose and wings, giving immediate feedback to gunners about their accuracy. 7 gunnery schools used these RP-63 aircraft for advanced training. Students who had mastered position firing principles using synthetic trainers and towed targets could now engage actual maneuvering aircraft. The RP-63 pilots, typically experienced instructors, would execute realistic attack profiles, while students in bombers fired frangible ammunition. This training provided the most realistic preparation possible, short of actual combat. The progression from basic principles to practical application required approximately 6 weeks. Students who entered gunnery school with no prior shooting experience graduated as adequately trained aerial gunners, capable of operating multiple turret types, maintaining their weapons under field conditions, and applying position firing principles under stress. But no amount of training could fully prepare men for the psychological reality of combat. The first time a German fighter came boring in from 12 o'clock level, cannons winking, closing at 500 miles per hour directly toward the nose where a gunner stood behind his guns, the training sometimes evaporated in pure terror. Some men froze, others fired wildly, burning through entire ammunition belts without aiming. The gunners who survived their first missions developed the emotional control necessary to fight effectively. They learned to manage fear, to maintain tactical awareness, to communicate clearly with other crew members over the intercom while fighters attacked and flak burst around them. Position firing doctrine provided these men with a systematic method, but implementation required discipline forged through combat experience. The German response to improved American gunnery evolved throughout 1944. Luftwaffe intelligence officers interrogated captured American airmen and examined wreckage of downed bombers. They discovered documents describing position firing and analyzed the implications. German tactical directives from mid-1944 noted that American bomber defensive fire had become more accurate and that attacking intact formations had grown increasingly costly. German fighter pilots adapted by emphasizing speed and aggression. The Sturmgruppen, flying heavily armed and armored Focke-Wulf 190s, would close to within 200 yards before opening fire, accepting hits from defensive guns to ensure their own cannon fire would be decisive. These tactics succeeded in destroying bombers, but resulted in catastrophic German fighter losses. Oberstleutnant Walther Dahl, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 3, described the tactical dilemma in post-war interviews. We had to get close to be effective against the heavy bombers, but getting close meant flying through concentrated defensive fire. The Americans had learned to shoot accurately. Their gunners no longer wasted ammunition firing wildly. Their bursts were directed, aimed, and often effective. The statistics tell part of the story. During the first half of 1943, before position firing was widely implemented, Luftwaffe fighter losses during missions against American bombers averaged approximately 3 to 5% of committed fighters. By the second half of 1944, after position firing had become standard doctrine and American fighter escorts had achieved air superiority, German fighter loss rates during defensive operations exceeded 15%. These increased loss rates resulted from multiple factors. Long-range P-51 Mustang escorts were the primary cause, shooting down hundreds of German fighters before they could attack the bombers. But bomber defensive fire contributed significantly. German pilots reported that attacking well-disciplined bomber formations remained dangerous even with escort fighters present. The concentrated defensive fire forced hurried attacks and sometimes scored kills. Staff Sergeant Russo completed his combat tour on April 15, 1944, having flown 25 missions. His crew survived intact, an outcome that became more common as 1944 progressed and American air superiority reduced loss rates. During his tour, Russo fired approximately 8,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. He was officially credited with 1 confirmed victory, the Messerschmitt over Leipzig, and 2 probables, fighters seen to be damaged but not confirmed as destroyed. These numbers were typical for bomber gunners. The vast majority of ammunition fired in combat missed its target entirely. Aerial gunnery remained extraordinarily difficult, despite improved training and systematic doctrine. But position firing removed one significant source of error and gave gunners a method they could apply consistently. The broader context reveals that position firing was one component of a comprehensive system. The combat box formations concentrated defensive firepower. The B-17G, with its 13 guns, provided overlapping fields of fire. Long-range fighter escorts protected bombers from the most determined attacks, Position firing doctrine ensured that when gunners did fire, their aim was as accurate as training and circumstances allowed. The integration of these elements transformed American daylight bombing from a desperately costly enterprise in 1943 to a sustainable operation by mid-1944. Loss rates that had approached 20% during the Schweinfurt raids of October 1943 declined to 3 to 5% by summer 1944. Crews completing 25 mission tours went from statistical improbability to reasonable expectation. The human cost remained horrific by any standard. The 8th Air Force suffered over 26,000 killed in action, more casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps sustained in the Pacific Theater. But the strategic campaign succeeded. German industrial capacity was systematically degraded. The Luftwaffe was crushed through attrition. And by D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied air forces had achieved complete air superiority over Europe. Position firing contributed to this success in ways that cannot be precisely quantified, but were nonetheless real. Every fighter that broke off its attack early because defensive fire was accurately directed represented a bomber saved and a crew that survived to fly another mission. Every German pilot who hesitated before pressing home his attack because American gunners had learned to shoot accurately represented a degradation of Luftwaffe effectiveness. The training manual Get That Fighter, distributed across the bomber force in late 1943 and early 1944, represented more than tactical doctrine. It represented systematic American approach to warfare, the belief that complex problems could be solved through scientific analysis, standardized procedures, and comprehensive training. The manual's opening statement captured this philosophy perfectly. Believe it or not, when a fighter is making his attack, you don't aim ahead as in other shots. Always aim between him and the tail of your own plane, because the forward speed of your plane is added to the speed of your bullet. This counterintuitive truth, once grasped, transformed how bomber gunners fought. Men who had wasted thousands of rounds firing at empty space ahead of their targets learned to aim behind and let physics carry their bullets forward into the target's path. The method required trust in principles that violated instinct, but those who mastered it became effective aerial gunners. The legacy of position firing extended beyond World War II. The fundamental principles, that projectiles fired from moving platforms inherit the platform's velocity and that aiming calculations must account for this factor, remained relevant in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War, B-29 gunners, defending against MiG-15 jet fighters, used refinements of position firing doctrine adapted for the higher speeds of jet combat. The advent of powered turrets with computing gun sights in the 1950s eventually automated much of the deflection calculation that position firing required gunners to perform mentally. The General Electric Fire Control System on the B-29 Superfortress, introduced late in World War II, mechanically calculated deflection and presented corrected aiming points to gunners. This system incorporated the same physics principles underlying position firing, but eliminated human calculation errors. By the time B-52 Stratofortresses entered service in the 1950s, tail gunners operated remotely controlled turrets, guided by radar fire control systems. The gunner sat in the forward fuselage, viewing his target through a periscopic sight, while the turret in the tail responded to his control inputs. Computing systems automatically corrected for platform motion, target motion, ballistics, and environmental factors. These automated systems represented the logical evolution of principles first systematically applied in position firing doctrine. But the human gunners of World War II, men like Staff Sergeant Russo, who learned to aim behind their targets to compensate for their bombers' forward speed, pioneered the methods that later systems automated. The story of position firing is ultimately a story about problem-solving under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Young men, average, age 22, were taught counterintuitive mathematics and expected to apply these principles while flying at 25,000 feet in 40 below zero temperatures, while German fighters attacked at 500 miles per hour, while flak exploded around them, while wounded crew members screamed over the intercom, while their aircraft shook from gun recoil and battle damage. That any of them succeeded is testimony to the effectiveness of systematic training and the extraordinary courage of ordinary men placed in impossible situations. That enough of them succeeded to help win the air war over Europe is testament to American industrial capacity, organizational ability, and the accumulated wisdom of thousands of instructors who refined doctrine through trial and error until it worked. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A 50 caliber bullet leaving the muzzle at 2,700 feet per second from a bomber traveling forward at 264 feet per second would follow a trajectory that combined both velocities. A fighter at 30 degrees deflection required the gunner to aim approximately 50 feet behind the fighter's apparent position to compensate for the bomber's forward motion. If the gunner aimed correctly, if he tracked smoothly, if he timed his burst properly, his bullets would converge on the target and hits would result. More often, the bullets missed. The fighter maneuvered, the bomber shuddered from turbulence or combat damage. The gunner's calculations were imperfect, the range was too great, or simple chance intervened. But position firing ensured that when conditions were right, when the gunner executed properly, his bullets went where mathematics predicted they would go, not where instinct suggested, not where traditional deflection shooting directed, but to the point in space where the target would be when the bullets arrived, accounting for every velocity vector involved. This was the revolution, not in technology, though better guns and sights helped. Not in courage, though bomber crews displayed extraordinary bravery. But in understanding, the recognition that aerial gunnery from moving platforms required abandoning intuition and trusting physics, that aiming behind could hit targets ahead, that the bomber's forward speed was not an obstacle to overcome, but a factor to be incorporated into every firing solution. The Luftwaffe pilots who faced American bomber formations in 1944 encountered gunners who had internalized these principles. German fighter pilots described a qualitative change in American defensive fire during this period. Where earlier the bomber formations had sprayed ammunition wildly, by mid-1944 the defensive fire was directed and effective. Tracers converged on attacking fighters with accuracy that forced pilots to break off attacks earlier or accept higher risks. This change resulted from multiple factors converging: better aircraft with more guns, long-range fighter escorts that reduced the intensity of attacks, combat experience that taught crews to work together efficiently, and position firing doctrine that gave gunners a method that worked. Technical Sergeant Morrison survived the war with 28 missions. In a memoir written in 1947, he reflected on the effectiveness of position firing. We were told it was counterintuitive, that it would feel wrong, but that the math was solid. They were right on all counts. Every time I aimed behind a Jerry fighter, part of my brain screamed that I was missing. But the tracers curved forward and hit where they said they would. Science works, even when you're too scared to believe it. The final accounting of position firing's effectiveness must acknowledge both what can be proven and what remains uncertain. Bomber-gunner kill claims were consistently overestimated during World War II. Multiple gunners fired at the same targets and all submitted claims. Damaged. Fighters diving away were often claimed as destroyed when they actually returned to base. The actual number of German fighters destroyed by bomber defensive fire was perhaps 10 to 20% of claimed totals, but effectiveness cannot be measured solely by confirmed kills. German fighter pilots who broke off attacks because defensive fire was accurate achieved the gunner's primary objective, which was not to shoot down fighters but to prevent their bombers from being shot down. Every attack disrupted, every fighter forced to fire from longer range, every German pilot who hesitated before pressing home his attack represented success for the bomber defensive system. Position firing contributed to this success by removing systematic errors from gunnery calculations. Gunners trained in the method stopped wasting ammunition by aiming too far ahead of their targets. Their fire became more accurate, not perfectly accurate, but accurate enough to force German pilots to respect the danger and adjust their tactics accordingly. The cost of implementing position firing was minimal. The doctrine required no new equipment, no technological breakthroughs, no complex modifications to existing aircraft. It required only understanding the physics involved and training gunners to apply principles that violated their instincts. The training infrastructure already existed. Gunnery schools simply modified their curricula to incorporate position firing alongside existing deflection shooting instruction. The return on this minimal investment was gunners who understood why traditional deflection methods produced systematic errors and who had been trained in a method that corrected these errors. Whether this translated to X% improvement in hit rates or Y% increase in German fighter losses cannot be conclusively determined from available records. But the testimony of those who flew the missions consistently indicates that position firing worked better than the methods it replaced. By war's end in May 1945, position firing had become so thoroughly integrated into bomber gunnery training that it was no longer considered revolutionary or controversial. It was simply how aerial gunners were taught to shoot. The manual "Get That Fighter" remained classified until the 1950s, not because it contained technological secrets, but because it represented tactical doctrine that might be relevant in future conflicts. The men who applied position firing in combat over Germany and Japan rarely thought about the physics or mathematics underlying the method. They thought about surviving the next mission, about protecting their crew, about going home when their tour ended. The doctrine became automatic through training and repetition, applied without conscious calculation in the fractions of a second available during combat. Staff Sergeant Russo returned to the United States in May 1944. He served as a gunnery instructor at Vegas Army Airfield in Arizona for the remainder of the war, teaching replacement gunners the same position firing methods he had learned at Las Vegas. He emphasized to his students the importance of trusting the doctrine even when it felt wrong. You'll want to aim ahead like you're shooting ducks. Don't. Aim behind. Your bomber is carrying your bullets forward. The math works. Trust it. Thousands of gunners trained under instructors like Russo deployed to Europe and the Pacific in the war's final year. They applied position firing doctrine in combat, defended their bombers, and contributed to the strategic campaigns that crushed the Axis powers. Some were killed, many survived. All had been taught a method that gave them the best possible chance of hitting targets under impossible circumstances. The story of bomber gunners learning to aim 50 feet behind their targets to compensate for their aircraft's forward speed is not a story of wonder weapons or technological breakthroughs. It is a story of systematic problem solving, of recognizing that existing doctrine contained fundamental errors, of developing corrected methods, and of training tens of thousands of young men to apply these methods under combat stress. It is a story about trusting mathematics over instinct, about fighting counterintuitive truths until understanding replaces confusion, about the cumulative effect of thousands of small improvements implemented systematically across massive organizations, and ultimately about young men doing impossible things because their country needed them to, because their crews depended on them, and because failure meant death. The Luftwaffe fighter pilots who exploded mid-dive, who rolled away trailing smoke after pressing attacks, who broke off engagements earlier than they would have preferred. These men encountered the practical application of position firing doctrine. They did not know the mathematical principles involved. They knew only that American bomber defensive fire had become more dangerous, more accurate, more deadly. Why bomber gunners started aiming 50 feet behind attacking fighters, and why Luftwaffe pilots began dying from what should have been impossible shots, comes down to physics applied systematically at scale. The bomber's forward speed added to every bullet's velocity. Aiming behind compensated for this forward motion. Gunners trained in this method stopped missing ahead of their targets, and the accumulated effect of thousands of gunners shooting more accurately contributed to winning the air war over Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.